Good morning. My name's Adam Tooze. I'm the director of the European Institute and chair of CGT. And it's my pleasure to be co-hosting this conversation this morning on the Eurozone with my dear colleague, Katerina. Maybe you'd like to introduce yourself, Katerina.
Yes, hi, I'm Katerina Pistor. I teach at Columbia Law School and I'm a member of the Committee on Global Thought. I am also one of the co-directors of the Center for Political Economy, which is co-sponsoring this event.
So we're going to do this podcast style as best we can, as befits the hour. I think it's worth sort of saying, perhaps as the backdrop to this event, that we scheduled this, I think it's maybe a couple of months ago, actually, and Katerina and I were having a kind of strategic think about what kind of events it would be cool to organize between the Center for Political Economy and the Committee on Global Thought. And, our minds as European-minded people turn to the Eurozone. Many of us will remember the years in which Eurozone crisis talk was the bread and butter of many of us in the macro finance and more broadly in the political economy scene. And we thought, well, maybe we should just schedule a Eurozone crisis event for early next year. How about after the German elections? And that obviously was a good idea. But on the other hand, I think both of us perhaps underestimated the degree to which the Earth would be shaken, the world would be shaken by really essentially the politics of the United States and the degree to which Trump 2.0 is a far more radical challenge to the existing order than Trump 1.0 was. So we started with a title which was Crisis in the Eurozone. And I'm tempted this morning, rather facetiously, to say that there's really crisis, everywhere else but the Eurozone in the current moment. And I wonder whether, Katerina, looking back, you share my sense of slight bewilderment. As indexed by this subtle, emphasis, that the point of emphasis that we made in that title a couple of months ago, thinking of the problem as largely internal and inward, and perhaps along classic lines to do with structural flaws of the Eurozone. And this morning, sitting here thinking more, well, the Eurozone might be one point from which we could, in fact, expect a coherent response to the disorder that is spreading outwards from the shocks being delivered by the United States.
Yeah, I think the emphasis is possibly on, we could possibly expect maybe some coherence spreading from the Eurozone. I think we are basically seeing how this is being attempted right now as we speak, really in real time. Let me just backstop a little bit. I think one of the things that, was questionable when we planned the hearing or the discussion at the beginning is how stable an outcome the German elections would produce. So it could have also been like months and months of uncertainty about what is the coalition that is coming about. I think probably it could have been 2 or 3 coalition parties, but it depended a little bit on how the outcome would work. It's not a big surprise that the CDU, the Christian Democrats, won and that Merz would emerge as the new chancellor in principle. What was a surprise, and that is, I think, very much driven, of course, by Trump too, is that one of the first things that Merz said, I think, just after the elections, is that we have to become more independent of the United States, and that has a lot to do with the Trump turn on Ukraine. But I think that kind of resets relations, transatlantic relations, and also the situation of course, German politics, but also European politics in the global context, including the euro and the eurozone. And on top of that, of course, we have sort of the move that so many waited for about Germany finally getting its act together and thinking about how to invest in the future. I think many of us may not have hoped that Germany would invest in arms, but maybe in infrastructure and in the green transition. But here we are. But the speed with which the Christian Democrats, which, like Schäuble, the old finance minister, was the one who embraced the black zero. So the whole idea that all of a sudden the country would embrace debt finance for future investments, including defense, at that speech and at that scale, I think that's kind of the big surprise, and it's forced by the moment that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, it is really a dramatic moment, isn't it? Because if you think back in German history, the CDU, the party of Konrad Adenauer after World War II, was really the party which, in the storms of post-war West German politics really flew the flag of what they called Westbindung, so the connection binding to the West, which means the United States, that strongly defended European integration as part of that project, right? Understanding European integration, contrary to the interpretation of more radical neoliberals like Ludwig Erhard or nationalists like the SPD, as a key element of an Atlanticist strategy. And I think over time, and that held all the way through to the 2010s and the Eurozone crisis and the Obama administration, many of whose veterans were in the Biden team, where there was really quite close collaboration between Berlin and Washington and New York on trying to stabilize the Eurozone. And in the Biden administration, very intimate relations between the Scholz team and the Biden team in the very careful calibration of Europe's response to the Ukraine crisis. And so now for a Christian Democratic leader to find himself in the position of having to, as you say, Katerina, like fulsomely and really quite assertively, announce the need for Germany's independence from the United States is really a historic drama. I mean, in the spring of 2017, we heard similar words from Angela Merkel, but not many actions followed. And I think there was a sense then that Trump 1 could be brought back into the fold. And I don't think there is that sense this time around. It does seem to me that Europe, and with the added urgency of Ukraine, the whole thing, the stakes are just so much higher. It's quite clear, I think, that the Europeans are not just bent now on raising military expenditure, which you could interpret as a continuity with America's demands for many years, that they increase their share of military spending to over 2%. There has a different flavor this time around, doesn't it? It does feel as though they're pushing towards something closer to a European alternative to America's backstop. Do you think that's an exaggeration, or you feel that?
No, I agree with this. I think this is not just ramping up NATO. I think people are also asking, is NATO still really valid, right? Would Article 5 trigger the response that one would have expected for decades? And it's not really clear whether this alliance will hold. What is clear is that the Europeans are trying to get their act together and say we do need some defense coordination. It's also, I think, interesting. We have to come back to the Eurozone in a second, but I think it's interesting to see the role of the UK and the coalition of the willing. So trying to break out of the straitjacket of just the European Union or just the Eurozone, although, of course, the ECB and the Eurozone will have to play a critical role as well. But it's interesting to see how sort of a new kind of alliance that is a bit more flexible, but clearly European, is forming in order to meet the challenge of the day. And the big question is whether, the resources are there and the coordination will happen and the politics will work this time around to make it possible for that to work through, which and what that is, of course, is to have a relatively reliable defense system in Europe, which probably we all recognize now is important against Russia. I hope not a two-front kind of challenge would come about, certainly, but a viable defense on the Eastern Front in Ukraine against Russia. And I think this raises all kinds of really interesting questions also for finance. One is, of course, the euro or the European Union. It's making its own efforts at a reasonable level, but also not huge, in trying to fund new defense investments. At the same time, Germany is saying it's going to relax the debt brake. And what I find personally a little bit troubling is that they don't just get rid of it, which is what I would probably advocate for. It's a relatively recent invention to basically bind your hands constitutionally, not spending over a certain amount of GDP. I don't think this is necessary. I think it's counterproductive for so many things, not only defense, but for other things as well. So I think the kind of compromise the SPD and the CDU are currently making is not satisfactory, but breaking the debt brake is, of course, what is needed. So I think that's the first point I would make. It's interesting that finally Germany gets there. It needs this for its own infrastructure, for its own investment. It needs it for many more things, not just defense. And I wish they would. They will go beyond that. But I'm wondering whether you also have some insights, especially the Greens came out quite forcefully, I think, against the statement that the SPD and the CDU were making last week, and maybe we can chat a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I just to pick up quickly on your point about us straying what seems like a long way away from the Eurozone. I mean, I would not think of this issue as distinct from the Eurozone conversation, in the sense that at the most abstract level, the knock on the Eurozone was always that Europe was completing, state formation at the monetary level, but not state formation at other levels. So starting close to the monetary system in the banking system, where there is still unfinished business in the European Banking Union in capital markets. But then in a wider sense, there was no, we had an intergovernmental system for policy making, and there was no defense strategy that was outsourced to NATO. And so the idea that Europe will now actually emerge, as a true defense actor, as a security actor in a deep sense, really complements, I think, the emergence of the process of monetary unification. And then to add to top on that, and we really do need to get on to talk about this, is the question of debt, right? It's the question of finance. It's the question, therefore, of how the fiscal statehood of Europe manifests itself. And this is where the German debate is so crucial, because there were two anchors to the German argument, weren't there, or the German position, and it's really quite a bipartisan position. And one was that there wouldn't be European debt except in extreme emergencies, which COVID then emerged as being one of. And the other would be that Germany's national debt burden would be tightly restricted by the debt brake rule that was introduced in 2009. And as you say, this has become now a running sore, and many of us have campaigned for over a decade about the irrationality of this agreement. To come briefly to the politics of the current moment in Berlin and in Germany, they truly are contorted, and I've been waging a kind of mini campaign by way of my platforms to try and make the Anglophone debate about this question more sophisticated than it's been, because the financial markets' response to the CDU-SPD paper was just, applause, because A, everyone agrees investment is necessary. B, the majority of opinion is also that defense spending is better. And furthermore, as you and I know and have long argued, government debt is not just a liability of future taxpayers. It's what Daniela Gabor calls the rocket fuel of modern market-based finance. And so more is better. And especially, to have $1 trillion of incredibly highly rated German paper finally available to do some things with is not where Germany has been, right? There's actually been a severe limit on the free float of bunds, the available amount of German debt that finance markets can work with. But to get to this, the promised land, the shock is A, that it's going to be led by a Christian Democrat who is not Angela Merkel, who's far more aggressive, who's a far more hard edge. He's the same age as Angela Merkel, but he just comes from the other side of the party, right? So it's a blowback to a harder edged CDU, on the one hand, which is a shock and a surprise, and it gives the whole thing a coloration that's in many ways quite unattractive for anyone progressive. And the second thing is that it rests on a truly shocking parliamentary maneuver, which has been hugely underrated in its significance in Anglophone commentary, which is this whole idea. So this is 500 billion fund for investment, a constitutional change to remove all defense spending above 1% of GDP from the debt brake, is going to be bounced through in what in Germany doesn't really exist, but they're trying to create, which is a lame duck period of the current Bundestag, with a majority of Christian Democrats, SPD and Greens who are not going to govern once the new Bundestag convenes. And you're doing this on an agenda which is not green. So the SPD and the CDU have agreed this defense package in part under the sign of not repeating the mistakes of the previous government. So one thing that's clear about this is it doesn't have the Handschrift, as the Germans would say. It doesn't look like or feel like or smell like the previous government, and yet they are relying on the Greens to deliver this majority. And this entire crazed maneuver is in aid of avoiding having to actually build a majority in the new Bundestag, which would be very difficult for Merz, admittedly, the Christian Democrats, because it would need to include Die Linke, who are really in many ways the true winners of the election in February, because they're the people that really surprised to the upside. The AfD did well, but not as well as it hoped. The CDU really didn't do well at all, but just happened to come out in front. The one party that really outperformed were the Greens, large numbers of young, radicalized German women voting for a party that kind of actively defends DEI, essentially, and a variety of other causes that progressives should adhere to. And if there's one thing that Merz doesn't want to do, it is negotiate with them. And so we're in this truly schizophrenic situation where a cause that is truly vital to the progress of both German and European politics, namely the expansion of German fiscal freedom, is being run through on a parliamentary basis, a political basis, which I think questions its legitimacy from the very beginning. And the ultimate nightmare, and I don't need to, you know this better than anyone here, the ultimate nightmare is they ram this through and then they face a suit by the AfD, the far-right party, that goes all the way up to the German Constitutional Court about the constitutional legality of what they've just done. And that could go very badly. And we would be in a perverse situation in which the AfD, is on the right side of a constitutional argument, which was about relieving the debt brake. And that, I think, would be what the Germans would call the Super-GAU, the worst possible, meltdown of democratic politics. It's a very ambiguous moment.
Yeah, I agree with this. It's both ambiguous and also fascinating. I think it is, of course, also deeply undemocratic. You basically allow the electorate to voice its opinions, and you have a new parliament. And then the most important thing that you want to try to do, you try to push through in advance. I think the Greens are currently very skeptical, but they also are trying to play like the good cops. It's a little bit like the Democrats here, still not realizing, what's going on. And I think for the Greens, it's a good thing that they go back into opposition so they can reform, sort of reposition themselves somehow. But if they feel compelled to support this, they do have to get more concessions out. And I would say, yes, of course, for green kind of politics, but maybe also beyond, because I think what the Linke and the AfD saying, we don't want to have more deficit funding, but I think the Linke would probably be willing to support getting over the debt brake if there was a real commitment also to spend the money on other things in the future. But to narrow basically the getting out of the debt brake in this particular way, the only way to ram this through, as you suggest, is to use the lame duck parliament right now, and for a constitutional change, that is kind of not a good position to be in, quite apart from the future litigation that we can speculate about. But I wouldn't be surprised if the AfD, and maybe with some people from the CSU as well, taking this into their own hands, and they're trying to prove their constitutionality by bringing such a suit.
Yeah, I mean, the Rubik's Cube of the politics here is fascinating because it's quite clear, I think, that the CDU, Merz leadership of the CDU, could probably only really do the debt brake move if it was tied to defense, because that satisfies the hawks, their right wing. The Linke, on the other hand, as I've spoken to senior leadership there, are willing to do a debt brake thing only if it doesn't specify defense, right? Because that will destroy the coherence of their party. The Greens, who are amongst the most Atlanticist, neoconservative, backers of Ukraine in German politics, as we know from Baerbock's stint as foreign minister, would have no problem with the defense side of this, but the investment fund doesn't essentially mention climate, and they can't go to their electorate without climate in there. And this is the Rubik's Cube that somehow has to be resolved. And I mean, I spoke to senior figures in the Green Party at the weekend, and it's quite clear that they're in a bargaining position of which the first move was simply not so fast. Don't assume that we're available. What is it you're actually going to offer us? The problem, of course, is the time clock on this is ticking so fast, right? The new Bundestag has to meet by the 25th of March. The legislation, which has the draft of which is now actually circulating for the first time today, I think, has to go through 2 readings or 3 readings in the Bundestag through committee stage, and then it has to go to the Federal Council, the Bundesrat, and in the Bundesrat, the CDU, SPD and Greens don't have a majority. They would need to have votes from somebody else. So this is the German Federal Council that represents the German states, and they would need liberal votes at that stage. So we think the investment infrastructure package is as big as it is as a sweetener for the regional government, because in the debt brake, the national government was severely constrained, but the state level and communal level in German politics are literally on balanced budget. They can't borrow at all. And that is where the big fall in public investment has taken place. That's where you really see the erosion of public infrastructure in Germany. Maybe this is, I mean, so we have to do this. Everyone's talking about, when we talk about Europe, we talk about Germany. You can't avoid this. And German politics, I think it's not an exaggeration to say that this is next to 2003 and the Hartz-IV reforms, maybe the most dramatic, significant, fast-moving shift. It's far more fast-moving than Hartz-IV in 2003 shift we've seen in Germany, and therefore in one of the world's biggest and most sophisticated democracies. I mean, it's a really dramatic instance that will interest political scientists. But how about let's pan out? We're not talking about the things that we used to talk about. Like when we talked about the Eurozone in the past, it was all bond markets in Italy and the ECB, and we're not talking about those. Do you think we should be? Do you think we're underestimating hidden risks here?
Well, I think so. I think there are two levels. One thing I think that is coming up, at least, it has to come up at some point, is whether the ECB shall engage in monetary financing. So basically, the extent to which it will backstop the government debt that Germany and other countries will issue. And as we recall, of course, from the Euro crisis, it first refused to do this, and then it kind of did it. And then during COVID, it did it again. And there were a number of legal challenges, of course, also from Germany, brought against these measures, which in the end kind of fizzled out. So I'm kind of grateful for the experience of the COVID crisis to suggest that actually the ECB also has learned from how to do it and how to package what it's doing in a way that, probably will get the blessings certainly of the European Court of Justice and possibly even from the Bundesverfassungsgericht. But in the end, it is the Court of Justice of the European Union that has the final call here. But I think it's an interesting, another transformative moment, because this is something that, of course, was written into the Lisbon Treaty and something that Germany has always insisted on. We're not doing monetary financing.
The ban on direct monetary finance is
exactly, and I think that probably is not sustainable in a situation where we're making huge investments in a kind of not a hot war, but in a Cold War situation where at the same time also government spending is of course limited by the inability to raise taxes in any meaningful way. So when you think about times of huge investments in defense, typically it went hand in hand also with a lot of new taxes, and in a world of capital mobility that we have today, that is a much harder proposition. So it's really debt finance, and debt finance does need backstopping, and it will need an active role of the ECB. So I think in addition to sort of changing the German take on debt as such, Germans' take on, first of all, monetary finance and possibly on Eurobond bonds will also shift. And so this gives us a new kind of de facto architecture. And my thinking as a lawyer is, of course, thinking through, can this be sustained legally? I mean, can we protect this, or will this require a kind of a change of the treaty, which, of course, then you have veto powers against that. But I think it is kind of happening as we speak through these things, because this is necessary to ensure that the program of debt finance and industry and defense spending and infrastructure spending will come about.
I mean, I'm really torn on this, because I mean, I see exactly what you're seeing, and I mean, this is the way the European project works. Like, it's this creeping, but in the end, transformative change, functionalism of a certain kind, as it were, new institutions emerging as solutions, functional solutions to existing problems, which then generate new problems, which then generate new solutions. This seems to be the way. There's the old hoary old cliche that, that the Europe is the product of its solutions to crises. I think all of that is true. There's a bit of me, however, that is also, and this was a lesson I think that came a little bit out of the Draghi report moment of last summer. Europe, as productive as the crisis discourse for Europe can be, generative indeed, and as much as it serves a function, notably in the German discussion, of opening the escape hatch to actually doing constructive things. Because if you can declare the exception, then all of a sudden you can do things. As a kind of realistic analysis of what's going on, there's a bit of me that worries whether we're not seeing in Germany the downside of some of the crisis discourse, because there's a lot of talk in Europe right now about war economies, and these giant mobilization pushes, and the Kiel Institute in Germany is putting out like long runs of historical data and comparing the current moment with the 1930s and the failures of British appeasement. And I kind of think, like, it's time to chill out, people. Like, what we're actually talking about is raising German military spending from, a technical 2, but a real 1.5% of GDP to maybe a real 3% of GDP, which is where the Federal Republic was in the 1980s. And that wasn't a war economy, right? The even the numbers in the coalition paper in Germany are, big at first glance, but German GDP is $4.5 trillion. European GDP is well over 20 trillion euros. Like, these numbers that are being floated around, once you break them down in terms of annual spend, they're not the stuff of war economics at all, right? And to that extent, another approach to this, and we may have folks from the markets on this call, like, I think a lot of this debt will just get sucked up by very, attractive this is good stuff for portfolio managers, especially at a time where you maybe prefer not to be in US treasuries. You could be in $1 trillion of bunds. And, they offer 2.5% now, but maybe if that settles at 3.5%, which is no drama, like, they all of a sudden become very attractive assets. And I wonder whether there isn't a kind of more smooth. I don't know whether Europe is best served by a rhetoric which says disaster, Trump threat, nightmare, crisis, structural problems, or whether it's actually better served by a kind of relatively self-confident position that says, we can do this, wir schaffen das, the Merkel rhetoric of 2015. This is within our wheelhouse, especially on the debt side. Like, if they do a couple of trillion, it's a tiny fraction of American issuance over the same period. I don't know how you feel about this, but are you more in the kind of alarmist camp or more in the cool corner, if I may say?
So I think I think there are maybe two levels to this. One, I think in the German politics, the alarmist is helping to push through the changes that we're talking about. It
also structures the debate, right? It drives it towards defense and away from climate.
Yeah, exactly. This is why I think for me, political wise, I think it should be just get rid of the debt brake and then just have politics again, how we spend and how we invest and how we use our public resources. And that, of course, would then also free us to say we're not building a war economy. It's also an awkward position for Germany to be in, right? To finally get rid of sort of a self-made straitjacket and do this in order to invest in military, which is exactly not what Germany was meant to do ever again. So I think that is disconcerting. In that sense, I think you're of course right in thinking about just saying, well, we're just issuing a new kind of relatively safe investment paper for the world, and investors can go into this. And maybe there is not so much need for the ECB right now. I think that it may. I mean, I think volume-wise, not necessarily. That probably private investors will pick it up. It's a question of sort of short-term versus long-term. It's sort of the smoothing kind of thing that the ECB might do. But I don't want to sort of paint already a crisis in the sovereign debt markets. I think German bonds have always been picked up, and they might become a bit more expensive, but they will probably find a lot of private buyers at this point. I agree with that. And I think at the European level, it would be really important to say, actually, we have the capacity. We have a 400 million plus market here. We have a powerful economy now at the center that is really powering through finally again. I think the real question is sort of whether the fragmentation of both the debt raising and the financing of this will produce ultimately a coordinated outcome, and how markets, including the banking sector, I think that you want to get to as well, will respond to that. Yeah.
Yeah, I should have said this right at the beginning, but we would, of course, love to have questions from the audience. I'm going to try and leave 15-20 minutes at the end for that. So if you want to start having thoughts or start pinging them in the chat or the Q&A, the team behind the scenes will manage this and let me know where they're going to appear. So it would be great to have questions. I'm sure this conversation will be stirring up. Hopefully will provoke you or raise questions. I mean, I think as a historian, I think there's one point I would like to make, which is that that this idea, I think, that Germany is suddenly becoming military as a result of this, the debt brake falling. I think that's a slightly illusory impression of the history of the Federal Republic. I mean, in the 1980s, the Bundesrepublik, the former West Germany, was a very conventional military power in terms of the percentage of its population under arms, in terms of general male conscription. It was just like Imperial Germany before 1914. It had an army of 500,000 men continuously under arms, and it had a reserve force that could go up at wartime strength of 1.3 million. It had a dozen very powerful divisions. It had thousands of tanks. Rheinmetall is not for nothing Europe's military industrial champion. It's like Germans never stopped making tanks. As soon as As soon as people needed tanks again in the 1950s, Rheinmetall got back in the business and everyone uses their cannon because they made the 88 in World War II and they still make really good cannons. Like Germany, the idea that somehow West Germany really stepped back in the 90s and the 2000s, it really did, right? And that's kind of the historic shift we have to make. German democracy has lived with the kind of levels of militarism that are being proposed in the current moment. That was its birth phase, right? You could argue that 68 was crucial in relativizing that, but nevertheless, I don't think there's any cause for panic in any case. But maybe in this like final exchange, before we get questions from the floor, we could pivot to the US a little bit. And I think there were like 3 dimensions I would really love to get your take on, because of your brilliant and path-breaking work on the legal construction of the international financial system and the centrality of the United States to that legal construction. We all know the importance of American assets. And I guess there are like 3 dimensions of the Trump shock, which kind of fascinate me. And I'd really love to get your take on how you think they might echo on the European side. I mean, the first is the big kahuna, the US Treasury market. Do we really see any kind of sense of uncertainty there about its standing? We've talked a little bit about the European side. The other one is banking regulation. I think this is going to be one of the stories to track in the Trump administration. I think, we were at a very interesting moment in global banking regulation with the Basel III, right? The Basel III round finally coming into effect. The G-SIBs led by JP Morgan always really hated those regulations. Is the Trump administration, amongst other things, going to go down in history? Not because they really have any view about it inside the Trump administration, but they obviously business friendly. And are they simply going to open the door to the total subversion and sabotage of Basel III? I think that's an unfolding story. And then there are a series of rather interesting questions about what consequences that has, because presumably it makes certain bits of the American financial system more vulnerable to crisis. What does that do? Not all of them, like the fortress balance sheets will be okay, but we did see SVB, there is fragility. And then the third element, at some level, perhaps the most superficial and obviously and easy to dismiss, and yet close to the cultural core of MAGA 2.0, is crypto. And the way, one element of this is pure grift, but then there is this other element who are these folks talking about stable coins as the outer bastions of the 21st century dollar system. And this is where they expect to stabilize. Each one of those, it seems to me, would mark quite a stark difference between the US and Europe, notably the crypto side, where the Europeans have been much more tough. Maybe on banking regulation. Anyway, I'd love to get your view about how you see those facets working through in the transatlantic relationship.
So I think the U.S. Treasury market and also the dollar more generally are interesting to watch. The problem is, most don't really see a real alternative yet. And so the question is whether this will shift with the developments that we just discussed earlier. But I think the reaction to, we see sort of stock market sort of right now being rather volatile, and but we haven't seen similar reactions. The dollar has a dent, but it's not as deep. And I think that is really sort of the lack for alternatives and maybe also the failure to recognize what's happening. It's also taken the stock market quite some weeks to realize that their expectations might not be matching reality anymore. So I think that I would be watching. It's sort of interesting to see, but it's not. I don't think I see it really manifest on those areas yet. What I do find most interesting, banking regulation, I would expect the Trump administration to relax. They did this last time. They basically started to dismantle from within the stress test for smaller banks and change some of the definitions. So it was not an open, full legislative reform of the Dodd-Frank Act, but it was basically weakening the rules and regulations, and then you have always regulatory forbearance. I don't think that they will be very strict on banking regulation, and they will, of course, allow the shadow banks and private equity and all that to rise. The real thing, I think, is really cryptocurrencies, because we're seeing sort of this. It's a typical, the kind of blackmail move. You can say blue mail or whatever color the cryptos have, but it's if you're big enough and you get that, then you are basically asking for support. You're asking for state support, and that's the reserves. So to the extent that you give them reserves, then you also have to live up to that in times of crisis. So basically capturing the state insurance system in one way or another for the new cryptocurrencies, I think that's sort of a struggle that is kind of unique to the United States because of the scale of the crypto markets. Now, they're not huge. That's the same discussion we had before. It's just like a war economy. It's not a crypto economy either yet. But of course, for those who are in these markets already, and there's some talks in the FT that sort of more banks and financial intermediaries are going into crypto. And of course, they're seeing the signs of the world because they do think that there might be state insurance backstopping the whole thing. And so this is of course, hugely beneficial for everybody who's in that market right now. But it's a social insurance for premium that were never paid in these markets.
Yeah, it's a truly extraordinary kind of live demonstration, isn't it, of different theories of money and how they originate. And, the statists are really winning out in the sense that clearly you start wherever you start in a libertarian anti-statist position. And at some point, as you're saying, state capture.
If you want to scale, you need it. Yes.
And then just outlandish, I mean, truly absurd. The Bitcoin, the crypto reserve concept is just so staggeringly absurd. But it just is a powerful demonstration of this sort of self-starting nature of monetary system. We do have some great questions in the flow. I'm going to be selective in the sense of picking the ones which move the conversation on rather than deepening the bits that we've already addressed. And there are two currently, Fabrice and an anonymous attendee, who are asking questions about what, for years and years and years was the central question of European fiscal politics, which is rules. Where do we stand on European fiscal rules and how the individual states relate to them? And what is the German politics going to be about rules now that they themselves are finding the limits of their own rule system? I think this is an underestimated element of the entire European fiscal rules debate, by the way. I always thought this during the Eurozone crisis, because the Germans did the debt brake largely to contain a federal fiscal problem within Germany, right? It was actually, in a very large part, an argument between Bavaria and Bremen and the East German states about how to constrain the high debt of the social democratic urban deindustrial places and Bavaria, which had very low debt on the other side. And of course, these entities in economic terms, Nordrhein-Westfalen, Bavaria, Baden-Württemberg, they're larger than the Greek economy. Like, they have bigger GDP than the Greek economy, more population in many cases. So then when you scale to the European level, it became, and Schäuble was, I think, a really good faith exponent of this, it became impossible to explain to German voters why domestically, in all of the local governance that they actually are affected by, a harsh debt brake was supposed to operate, whereas at the level of Europe, Greece was supposed to get a free ride, right? And that became, which was smaller than Nordrhein-Westfalen. And so it became really difficult to communicate. And I think that's very interesting. It's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out on the German scale. So we have Anonymous asking about fiscal rules, and then we have Fabrice asking about the relationship between the more frugal countries and the higher spending cases. France is the key issue here, because as we know, last year, French politics were utterly convulsed by the sense that France faced an existential fiscal crisis. It was going to become not Spain, but worse than Spain. And Italy's yields were lower than those of France. And the world was turned upside down. How do you see the politics of this playing out in the Eurozone?
I mean, unfortunately, what we've seen before, even before the Euro crisis, is that typically the big countries get away with exceeding the limits set by the rules, and the smaller kind of don't, or they only in sort of exceptional circumstances. So you drive Greece basically to almost being pushed out of the Eurozone at that moment, and maybe we rescue them again. But Germany and France also had broken the limits before, and not much really happened against them. And so I think the de facto muddling through strategy in Europe is very much driven by the more powerful countries. And I think luckily for France, if France was alone, it would be a bit more difficult, especially suppose that Merz had been more like the budgetary conscious person. Let's assume it hadn't been Trump but Harris. Maybe we would have seen a different dynamics between the two countries. But Germany now being willing to embrace this, and it's not completely going overboard, but I think it's embracing a more loose fiscal policy. I think that might help France as well. The interesting thing is, of course, that the Mediterranean countries, those that were sort of the high-risk countries before, have cleared up their budget and are in a better position right now to face this. But so that's how I would see it. I don't think we will have a formal revision of the Maastricht Treaty anytime soon, but I think we will just have a kind of forbearance of the enforcement of these rules.
Sorry, you set my mind reeling with the counterfactual of how would this have all played out if Harris had won. Like, how are we going to end up with a rather perverse view of Europe's history in which the great leap forward in collective fiscal policy and Germany's self-liberation from the debt brake was essentially enabled by the Trump presidency in the US, and under, the more conventional transatlanticist norms that we might have expected to prevail under Harris, perhaps we wouldn't be in this position. We wouldn't be able to, Germany would not be making these moves. It's quite a shocking scenario, isn't it? Do you see, I mean, the other really profound historical irony that strikes me is indeed that, that very painful history that you were alluding to a minute ago of the Greek drama, because one of the essential demands made by Germany, and again, it was on behalf of German democracy, was that major decisions about European finance should not be bounced through on predetermined, extremely tight timelines when, the decision was foreordained and the Bundestag didn't really have a chance to seriously debate whether or not to support the rest of the Eurozone or not, right? And so there was this, and I think, again, it was a good faith argument. It was obviously an argument made from a position of power and privilege. It's the rich and the safe that can afford to wait, whereas the Greeks and the Spanish and the Italians needed prompt action, and everyone else in the world, including the Obama administration, was saying, what don't you understand about Lehman? Like, it's time to go, you've got to act. And the Germans would solemnly say, oh no, this has to be properly discussed in the Bundestag. And now we're in the situation where and that was a treaty, relevant thing. This is the German constitution itself that has to be discussed in 2 weeks. So there's this asymmetry that you're alluding to is really very painfully obvious in this thing.
Yeah, but let me just add to this. I also find it kind of interesting how the budgetary control and democracy are invoked in different ways, right? On the one hand, we do the debt brake, which is also anti-democratic because it binds future governments. I mean, like in corporate law, I would say this is like the dead hand, or in trust law, you can't bind future governments that are elected by different electorates in that fashion. I think it's deeply, deeply undemocratic, but then hold it against the ECB if it wants to loosen monetary policies to maintain the euro and say this is anti-democratic because the Germans can't control their own budget. It kind of doesn't really fit together, does it?
Yeah, no, I was always in favor of a constitutional case against the debt brake. I mean, I don't understand why it was left to the right wing. I mean, if you think of constitutional litigation as being productive of new law and new understandings of the constitution, why was it that all of the action was left to essentially right-wing nutters who would endlessly attack any effort to break out of and they were coached by the court. I mean, the court would tell them this argument didn't work, but how about if you went down this route? And there was never any similar process of aggressive litigation from the left liberal side saying exactly as you're saying, that this was, the German constitution makes all sorts of bold promises about freedom and, equal treatment.
Social market economy, yes.
I mean, it was actually a rich document which you could have mined for arguments, and that binding one is the most egregious, really. We have two lines of questioning that break from here, and maybe we should pursue both of them. I'm determined it's important with these kind of sessions to finish punctually because everyone has lives to get to. But this is really a rich line. Maybe we start with the more technical side because it's more technical. How about, if you look through the papers of Bruegel or the key European think tanks right now, there's this kind of rather spooky literature about things like completing capital markets union, completing the banking union. Amidst all of the drama that's going on, it almost feels like, you're visiting another world when you go to those conversations. But is that kind of assessment correct, or are really quite fundamental elements of institutional structure really still in play in Europe that that we need to address, that need to be resolved, that should be thought of as part of this? If this is a Hamiltonian moment, do we have to carry along this institutional baggage and these technical decisions as well? And which ones would you think of as being the key ones?
So I think a lot of progress has been made on the banking side and the regulation of the large banks at the ACB essentially, and I think that I think is much more robust than it has ever been. I'm a bit of a skeptic of the capital market union because you can look at it from two sides. You can say we want to create a common market, and so we want to have common rules, but you're also creating a highway for investors to play by the same rules wherever they go, and you're exposing the entire system to the same kind of risky strategies that they might bring along. So in my view, actually, especially in finance, having some frictions in the system, and that would include different rules in different parts of the system in Europe as well, is not such a bad thing. The question is, of course, then when crises emerge, can you actually localize them, or do they become contagious then for the entire system? And that has a lot to do with the ability, I think, of the European Central Bank to respond accordingly. But I think the whole idea of basically having to harmonize these rules in a particular way, and it's still very much inspired by this idea we have to meet the US where the US is in financial market development. I also see a little bit the Draghi report of last year going in this direction, right? Sort of this competitiveness with the US. And I think this is also a moment where Europe should step back and say, what kind of capitalism are we actually supporting? And that's why I would basically probably invest a little less in sort of streamlining these rules and creating these unions, because it's still so much motivated by this competitive drive, and rethink them from a different perspective.
I wanted to ask you about the Draghi report. I mean, and I'm very interested to hear your initial take on it there, because it is this. So this is the report. There were two big reports about European competitiveness issued last year, both by very senior Italian politicians, both ex-prime ministers. Letta, I think he's an ex-prime minister, isn't he? And Draghi, both men of the pre-Meloni Italian elite. So these were the guys that gambled on the vincolo esterno, the idea that you could speed up the pace of Italian growth and dynamism by tying it to the tough constraints of Europe set by competitive North Europeans like the Germans and the Dutch. And so Italy would kind of grow through this constraint. And this was the significance of, say, Draghi being prime minister in Italy in the wake of the COVID crisis was that all of these elements of politics came together. And I think, broadly speaking, one has to say that they got their way at some level, but perhaps more in the sense that they changed the European institutions in a way they needed to go. In other words, Draghi didn't so much change Italy as he changed the ECB, which was crucial. But then these two characters in 24 issue these reports on European competitiveness, I think, is the rubric they were both done under, which is a terrible, in some senses, meaningless economic rubric to have any serious conversation about economic policy, because it makes sense for businesses, perhaps, but it doesn't make sense for national economies to benchmark themselves that way. But the Letta report was accepted by the German conservatives because it's really a kind of fairly anodyne report that basically says we should complete all the markets. You don't, it'd be great. I'd love to hear your view on the Letta report. The Draghi report immediately produced this allergic negative response from the German side because it sounded like a weird, hybrid of French and American ideas about how to boost capitalist economic growth, which is basically bigger government, more investment, more R&D, European champions, that entire vision. But it did absolutely, and I think quite overtly and aggressively pose the question, and this has been on Draghi's mind all along, is what kind of capitalism, what kind of society does Europe want to be? And the vision he was offering there was really goodbye to social Europe, goodbye even in a sense to ordo-liberal social Europe, the social market economy vision with tough competition rules, and instead some sort of business-led, technology-led, defense-led national champion kind of vision of Europe. And I think it was a very ambiguous kind of reform agenda, and certainly not one that should easily be embraced by the progressives. But I'm very, very struck by your reaction. Do you have a different view on the Letta report? Is that not as anodyne as I think it
Well,
is?
I think that the Letta report, of course, benefited from the fact that he had gone around and talked to so many constituencies. And the weakness of the report is that exactly that's what he did, because he's kind of almost pleasing everybody with whom he's spoken. And so it feeds into, I think, the demands of lots of different people, but it's not really clear what policies exactly come out of it. So I think it's a good report to read, to see what is the state of the world in Europe viewed through the eyes of the people that he engaged with, and then his interpretation of what they said. But it's not really sort of clear where you go with this. So Draghi is much more forceful as to where you go, and I think he's sort of in this. I was just thinking a little bit about sort of this literature on economic backwardness, with Gerschenkronen, and so Europe trying to catch up with the US now, or being a global force, and what is the strategy that we have to do? And since we didn't create our own big tech companies, and we're behind maybe in the financial sector, so we now have to do the big push as Germany might have done in the 19th century. And I'm not sure this is the right strategy for where we are right now, and also quite clear who's going to call the shots on this. And neither is it clear whether the long-term structures that we're creating in this way will serve the European Union well. But I think raising the questions of what kind of model of capitalism we want to have, I think that should be on the agenda of policymakers right now again.
Yeah, I mean, it's a remarkable report, in part because it actually reverses the Philippon case. So there was this famous case of cell phone prices in Europe and the United States, and the argument was always social market ordoliberalism actually worked in Europe because competition policy kept the cell phone companies small, and the rates, well, anyone knows who's spent any time there, much lower than in the US. And Draghi flips that on its head and says, because they don't make enough profits, they can't invest in 5G, and so therefore. So it's an incredible, I suppose, a historian with my historian's hat on, I think people are going to be quoting this report forever after as a moment of where this discourse shifted. Folks who are interested in understanding more about the actual basis of European industrial policy right now, I would strongly recommend a piece by my friend Sander Todor in Foreign Policy, which really gives an important corrective to simplistic views about Europe's position. Let's end, Katerina, with the grim, but I think necessary political kind of questions. We started by talking about the maneuvers that the CDU-SPD coalition, fugitive CDU-SPD coalition, are involved in Germany to avoid the actual outcome of the election, in which 83% of Germans voted. So this was a huge democratic success. At that level, unfortunately, the new voters overwhelmingly go to the AfD in the German case. They're the most successful party at mobilizing new voters. A lot of people, our questions as well, are worrying about the current moment as a little bit of a false moment of calm before a world that could be much grimmer, where Alice Weidel, actually, her prediction comes true, that a CDU-SPD government is a recipe for further growth on the AfD side, where the complex coalition holding the far right at bay in France collapses, and the centrists have to pay the price for having excluded the left after the momentous French elections. How do you see that? I mean, this is obviously, for both of us, a kind of speculative exercise in thinking about European politics, but it must be on your mind. And I'm kind of curious about how your judgment of the current moment is shaped by whatever your view is of the future.
So yeah, it's obviously speculative, but it's similar to the counterfactual "what if Harris had won" kind of situation. I think in that sense, Europe might be benefiting from the fact that the Trump administration is such a disaster, and to see in real time what is happening here. It was interesting that Madame Le Pen was actually siding with the Ukrainians and basically saying it was brutal in the way that the US is pushing them into the arms of Russia. And she's, was allegedly has received some money from Russia as well. So it may also very well be that the investment boom, whatever size, but certainly the much needed investment sort of will give a boost to the economy that will mitigate the run towards the AfD. So it's kind of I don't want to be sort of too hopeful, but I think sort of the constellations in Europe might well be changing because of what's happening here, and hopefully for the better. Now, I don't want to downplay completely the extent to which Musk has its influence there through social media and but I think the real world experience of economic change might make a difference. It's no guarantee. I think, Biden made a huge difference for many people and they still voted for Trump. So it's not clear. It's not only an economic problem, it's also a culture war. So I think the new coalition government has to be really careful in terms of how they portray what they're doing and how many people they can bring along.
It would be extraordinary, isn't it, if we ended up with an Atlanticist Marine Le Pen and an Atlanticist Maloney, because Maloney, after all, made her global career, with her staunch stance with NATO on Ukraine. One piece of good news, perhaps, finally to conclude with, is just Tesla's collapsing sales in Europe. The data for the January month, and this is January before things got really hot, down 47% at the same time as the rest as the electric vehicle market in Europe, contrary to its critics, continues to rise. So I've never been a friend of the straight through industrial policy makes social change, changes voters' minds, saves you from the populists kind of a logic. I don't think that actually holds water in the US, as you were saying. It certainly didn't translate as a tactics. I think you need to do broader social policy to affect, families, essentially. You need this family scale, community scale policy, not building fancy factories with a few thousand workers to really make that difference. But I actually think that culturally it may turn out the political culture of Europe may simply be more resistant to MAGA, at least. That doesn't preclude, I think, specifically European kind of right-wing politics, a la Meloni, becoming quite dominant. And immigration is going to be, I think, the canary in the gold mine here. We haven't spoken about immigration at all. But one of the truly bizarre moments of recent months was, after all, J.D. Vance lecturing the Munich Security Conference to be meaner to immigrants. It's like, I'm sorry, like, I don't know what fantasy world that man lives in terms of the politics of immigration in Europe, but we're not in the Merkel 2015 moment, right? Regrettably, we're in a moment of near consensus across the board on truly harsh immigration policies. Perhaps a topic for another conversation. Katerina, I see the time. Thank you so much for joining me in this morning. It's really, it's great. I have a feeling we should do this again. It was a real pleasure. And thank you everyone for attending and joining. And thank you to the team in the background for putting this on for us.
And apologies for that. We didn't get to all the questions. I saw some of them. Yes. They're great, but another time.
Yeah. Another time. And I think maybe we do need to have a regular Euro chat to keep this conversation going. Thank you to everyone. Have a good day.
Adam. Have a good day. Bye-bye.